All right, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar room. Things will pick up in just a moment, but first we'll leave some time for more folks to join in. Hi to everybody coming in from the waiting room. We'll get started in just a moment. All right, welcome to our Grow Native webinar, Vitis rupestris, the native Missouri grape that saved French wine, with Dr. Allison Miller. My name is Amanda Lansbramrapp, and I am the Events and Communications Coordinator for the Missouri Prairie Foundation and Grow Native program. Thank you for joining us for the next webinar in our 2025 series. Today's presentation starts in the not-so-distant past as we learn how native Missouri grapevines impacted global viticulture. This example raises the question, how are wild species connected to agriculture and which other wild species might be the progenitors of future crops? We'll get to the bottom of those questions shortly, but before we continue, I'll review a couple of Zoom basics. When you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A section of your screen, which you'll find on the bar at the bottom of your Zoom window. They will be read aloud and answered following the presentation's conclusion. We're joined today by Carol Davitt, MPF's Executive Director for the Q&A. Thanks in advance for all of your thoughtful live submissions. All who have registered can look forward to receiving a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to the recording and more resources. Now, I'd like to more thoroughly introduce Dr. Allison Miller. Allison is a principal investigator and member at the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center and a professor of biology at St. Louis University. She is a research associate at the Missouri Botanical Garden. Research carried out by the Miller Lab Group focuses on perennial plant biology, diversity, and evolution. The overarching aim of this work is to advance fundamental understanding of the genetic and environmental determinants of phenotypic variation in perennial species, with the goal of improving and developing perennial crops that benefit people and the planet. Originally from the Chicago suburbs, Allison earned a BS and MS degree in botany from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and Colorado State University, respectively, and holds a PhD in ecology, evolution, and population biology from Washington University in St. Louis. She completed postdoctoral training at the University of Colorado. More information is available on the Miller Lab website, which we'll link to all of you in the follow-up email tomorrow. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Miller. Looks like we're ready to learn. Over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Amanda. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm going to go ahead and, let me just get to my first slide here. There we go. We'll start with a slight amendment to the title here. We will be talking about how the native grape saved the French wine industry and other industries, but I will be wrapping up with a focus on some other botanical superstars. So I'd like to start just with a moment of gratitude for the incredible diversity of plants that we find in our native prairies, and also just a moment of humility to appreciate the incredible biodiversity that we have around us here in Missouri and in other parts of the world. But what I'd really like for you to remember from this talk today is that this natural biodiversity is important not only for the ecosystem processes that we appreciate it for, but it has a critical role to play in agriculture. And that will be the focus of my talk. We'll start with a quick reminder that all of our crops, every plant that we grow for food and that we eat, originated from what were once wild plant populations. I'll start with a familiar example, just corn, which is native to this region of Mexico, the Sierra de Manatlan. And the wild relatives of corn, some might know it as teosinte, look a little bit like our modern day corn. This is shown in the picture here, what the original ancestor of corn might have looked like. And it's kind of its cob, a very small structure. Maybe it's the size of my pinky, maybe 6 or so seeds. what we're talking about are an example of the where geographically and the types of lands and the types of populations a common crop originated from maize or corn. So we've already discussed this is what the wild progenitor or the wild ancestor of corn looked like from these wild populations over the course of approximately 10,000 years. This plant was selected upon by people and ultimately evolved into the very common, very widely planted crop of today, maize. This is the process of domestication. It is an evolutionary process with humans acting as the agent of selection. So agriculture, we know, originated more than 10,000 years ago. It has evolved over time and it's going to continue to evolve in the future. And this is kind of where the connection, I think, to our contemporary native plants come in. Agriculture and the crops that we grow is not something that happened in the past and is over. It is very much a alive and well discipline as we continue to develop crops for today and for the future. So if we just take a historical retrospective here, we know that humans lived on the planet for 450,000 years or so, anatomically modern humans. The vast majority of that time was spent as hunter-gatherers. The first agricultural revolution happened approximately 10,000 years ago when in different places around the world, hunter-gatherers started shifting to instead of gathering, but more to actually planting individual plants. And it was through that early agriculture that those first cycles of selection, those first phases of domestication happened. From there, there were other agricultural revolutions. I'm just going to touch on a few here, but there are many important steps that happened in this process. A second one was a shift from lower production agriculture to higher production agriculture. Some trace this back to the 1700s or and into the 1900s as people started growing higher density populations of plants and higher yielding plants. A more recent revolution, one that some may be familiar with, the Green Revolution, happened in the 1950s and 60s, where modern approaches and the work of many pioneering, very famous scientists, including Norman Borlaug, began really actively breeding and selecting for specific traits. Norman Borlaug, of course, working primarily to increase the yields of wheat. Now, I would argue, and I think some others might too, that we're currently in another agricultural revolution right now. And this agricultural revolution is focused on improving crops and improving yield, but also doing so in a way that makes our crops more sustainably harvested with less net detrimental impacts on the land. So we're really talking about shifting agriculture to meet both the needs of people and the needs of the planet. Now, I'm going to come back to this later in the talk, but one of the main things I'd like for you to just keep in mind as we're going through this is that wild plant species were and continue to be the foundation of agriculture. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is introduce two terms or kind of categories of wild plants that are currently being used to improve current agriculture and or begin to innovate crops and agriculture for the future. The first term is this term crop wild relative. Some of you may have heard of this. These are plant species that are the cousins or really the close relatives of major crops, of our major food crops. These species still grow in nature. And they offer means to improve our existing crops, their domesticated cousins, in lots of different ways. I'm going to give an example of that in just a moment. The second category of wild plants, native plants that I think is important, I hesitate because it's not just native plants, but wild plants in general that are important for agriculture today and in the future are plants we're calling relatively wild crops. So these are wild species, or in some cases, hybrid derivatives. So they've been crossed with other species that have really only recently entered the domestication pipeline. They're not well-known crops. They're not really even crops. They're wild species that are just starting to be investigated as potential crops. And I'll give a couple examples of this towards the end. I wanted to just give a quick shout out to a good friend of mine and colleague, David Van Tassel at the Land Institute, who coined this term of relatively wild crops. It's a term we use just, I don't know, just kind of in a laughing way because there's so many potential species that could contribute to agriculture. One of them, you see us here clinking beers here in St. Louis at Blue Jay Brewery. One of these relatively wild crops is a grass, intermediate wheatgrass. It goes by the trade name Kernza, that some local brewers have been using to make beer. And that's actually what we're drinking in this picture. So I'd like to now turn our focus to this term of crop wild relatives. Again, the wild relatives of our major crops. And for this, I want to give an example, close to home example of a native Missouri grape that is credited with saving French wine. So remember, a crop wild relative, these are the wild cousins of our modern crops. And the native grape that we'll focus on here, Vitis rupestris, the rock grape. Now, some of you may be familiar with this really interesting grapevine. It's called the rock grape for a great reason, which is that it grows on the gravel bars of the beautiful creeks and streams that occur here in Missouri, in parts of Oklahoma and Arkansas, parts of North Texas, and even moving north and east of our region up into some parts of Ohio and Pennsylvania, although I think it's less common in that part of the country. So the rock grape is pretty interesting because it is in the genus Vitis, which is the grapevine genus, but it doesn't really climb like a grapevine does. It's more of a crawler, and we've grown it many times and tried to force it to climb, and it just really doesn't like that. So the rock grape can be found in many places in Missouri. This is a picture from Marys County, Missouri, where we found it. You can kind of see it in the foreground of this picture. Again, it grows in these gravel bars, and it is a rare. Actually, I don't know if it's technically classified as rare in the state of Missouri right now, but it's always on the borderline there. So we're going to talk a bit about how this rock grape has been important for grape growing or viticulture here in the US and around the world. So this is a picture of the Crown Valley Vineyard in St. Genevieve, Missouri. This is a typical vineyard in the state of Missouri. Grapevines are so fascinating for so many reasons. Cultivated grapevines are. And I show this picture to just help everybody think about what grape growing looks like and appreciate the number of different species that actually go in to making a grapevine. So in this particular vineyard, what's growing here is a local grapevine called Chambourcin. This is what they call a French hybrid. It's actually the product of multiple crosses between the European grapevine Vitis vinifera and several native North American species, which I've listed here. So Vitis cinerea variety Helleri, Labrusca, Lincoumii, Riparia, and rupestris, the rock grape. These French American hybrids were developed because in our neck of the woods and in the eastern parts of the US, the disease pressures on grapevines are so serious that Vitis vinifera, the European grapevine, really doesn't do well here just on its own. So grapes like the rock grape have been really critical in developing these French American hybrid vines that predominate viticulture in Missouri and in other states in the Midwest and in the East Coast. All right, but let's move out of Missouri for a minute and move into grape growing regions in Europe. So we're going to go from Crown Valley straight over to the Rioja region of Spain. This is a big grape growing region, and what you're looking at here are a number of different Spanish varietals. And all of these vines in this picture are the European grapevine Vitis vinifera. But interestingly, they are all grafted to root systems that are derived from native North American grapevines. So in this particular vineyard, one of the grapes, one of the varietals that is growing here is a variety called Verdejo. This is a white grape. It's one of my favorites, highly recommend it. But these Verdejos, as well as the other varietals, are grafted again to these rootstocks. And so for those of you that are not familiar with the process of grafting, this is an ancient technique that consists of joining two genetically distinct grapevines to one another. And it's actually pretty cool because the it separates the process of vine selection into an above ground portion, and people can select what they want for that. It's usually referred to as the scion, and a below ground portion, which growers and breeders have selected what they want, attributes that they want in the roots. That's called the rootstock. So let's take a quick digression into grafting, because this is actually a pretty crazy situation. So the definition of grafting is just a process that typically joins two plant organs, usually a root system from one plant and a shoot system from another plant. And those two sections, when it actually happens, it looks like kind of sections of stems fuse together, and the vascular connections form between the two genetic entities, and they're able to survive in a unique symbiotic relationship. So this is a lot of terminology, but it's essentially two different grapevines growing together. So grafting, interestingly, occurs in nature. It can happen between the stems or roots of the same individual or the same species, and sometimes between species from different plant genera or even plant families. So in this picture here, you can see a natural grafting of the eastern white pine, where the roots of these two plants are growing together. In the center picture, there's grafting of yellow birch, root grafting in apples, and then natural root auto grafting of a strangler fig on a sable palm. So again, these are just different plants that literally fuse together. Of course, we don't know anything, we don't have anything like this in people in terms of like individuals fusing together, but it is not uncommon in the plant world. So the horticultural practice of grafting is pretty ancient. It dates back to the time of the Romans, and we know this in part due to mosaics that actually show how folks were piecing together parts of plants. Grafting was mentioned in the Hippocratic treatise. There's indirect evidence from China, and we know it was practiced in the Mediterranean region dating back to the 5th century at least. Now, having said that, although this is an ancient art, it really wasn't a thing in grapevines until relatively recently. Last thing I'll say about grafting, it's really quite common. Roughly 70% of our perennial woody crops are clonally propagated, so they're grown from cuttings. And of those, about 70 major crops, so things like apples and oranges and of course grapes, almonds. There's a number of pretty much every major woody crop you can think of is commercially grown through grafting. So in agriculture, this is actually a pretty common process. Okay, so let's get back to the vineyard here. So of course we're looking at this vineyard in Spain, where we have a European grapevine that is grafted to North American grapevines, including the rock grape. So I mentioned that grafting is ancient, but it only happened recently in grapes. This is a very famous story, how this came to be. The long and the short of it is that some of the grapevines that were growing in North America were taken to Europe as a curiosity in the middle of the 1800s. And those grapevines were introduced into grape growing regions of France. We actually know exactly where the first North American grapevines were introduced in the south part of France. We know that because the grapevines that were introduced brought along with them a little friend. The friend was an aphid that goes by the name of phylloxera. Phylloxera is an aphid that is native here in North America. It has a above ground part of its life cycle where it makes galls on the leaves. I have some grapevines that have phylloxera galls on them right now. It also has a below ground phase of its life cycle where these little aphids like to suck the sap out of the roots of grapevines. Now, native North American grapevines have evolved and co-evolved with this aphid and have a natural capacity to heal the wounds that come from this aphid. However, when the aphid was introduced into the European grapevines, into vineyards like this one in the south of France, which at that time were wholly Vitis vinifera, both shoots and roots, the aphids hopped off of the introduced North American vines and started chomping away on the European grapevines. And what happened is that the vines started to die from the roots up. People didn't know what was happening because the above ground portion of the life cycle hadn't presented itself yet. And it's estimated that 60% of the vineyards in not only in France, but across Europe perished at this time. It was a huge crisis. Okay, so there's a wonderful book that was written about this. It has two titles, but it's the same book. One is the Botanist and the Vintner, How Wine Was Saved for the World. The other is just called Phylloxera. Same book. But in this book, it chronicles the introduction, the accidental introduction of phylloxera, and it spread from France into Portugal, Spain, Italy. Ultimately, it showed up in California and really spread through most of the grape growing regions of the world. This was a challenge. It was a problem to be solved. And it inspired an international collaboration between French scientists and scientists who were based here, actually in St. Louis, primarily George Engelmann and Charles Riley. So again, this is happening kind of in the middle of the 1800s. So at the time, Julien Planchon was a French botanist, and it was Julien who discovered that phylloxera was actually what was causing this blight, because remember, the vines were dying from the roots and folks didn't know exactly what was going on. So eventually that got figured out what the culprit was. Julien Planchon started working with Charles Riley, who was a British-born entomologist working in the US. He was the state botanist of Missouri and later served as an entomologist with the US Department of Agriculture. There's George Hussman, who was living in Hermann, Missouri at the time. George sent hundreds, if not thousands, of North American grapevines to France. Why would we be sending these vines to France when it was those vines that caused the problem to begin with? Well, the reason is it was determined that either the Europeans were going to need to hybridize their vines with native North American grapevines, or they would need to graft them. And that's actually ultimately what ended up happening. It's the grafting, remember, that allows these plants to exist with a European portion of the plant producing the actual grape berry that's used to make wine, grafted to a root stock, a root system that is the North American vines that have this capacity to heal the wounds that are caused by this phylloxera aphid. Okay, a couple other folks who contributed here. Hermann Jaeger, born in Switzerland. He was a grapevine breeder who sent phylloxera-resistant rootstock to France from Missouri. He was living and working in Neosho. And then T.V. Munson, who was born in Illinois, but ultimately moved to Denison, Texas. He was also a grapevine breeder. And he sent this other species of grapevines, Vitis cinerea subspecies helleri, which is native to the very chalky soils of the Edwards Plateau in Texas over to Europe, because as it turns out, the vines that were sent initially, they provided some of what the European grapevine growers needed in terms of a rootstock, but there were some inefficiencies related to the soils in Europe, and it was breeding with this other Texas species that helped introduce that adaptation. All right, so let's head back out here to Marys County. This was the picture that we looked at earlier. This is a picture, I introduced it because Vitis rupestris is in the foreground, but what you don't see are, or what I can't point out in this picture easily, is that there are at least 4 other native grapevines growing within this habitat. One of them is Vitis riparia. Vitis riparia is the riverbank grape. It's interesting because it's very closely related to Vitis rupestris, but it is, instead of being a crawler like Vitis rupestris, the rock grape, Vitis riparia is a plant that grows right up into the canopy of the forest. Instead of growing on rocks, it really prefers to be growing in moist soils. And so the role that Vitis rupestris played in the development of rootstocks that the European viticulture enterprise ultimately ended up being grafted to is that it was hybridized with other species. And so this figure here just shows how Vitis rupestris, the rock grape, was crossed with Vitis riparia, the riverbank grape, and the offspring of that cross formed a grapevine rootstock named 3309C. This is the genetically distinct individual that has been cloned many times, and it is the rootstock that a rootstock commonly used by growers. And commonly used to graft their favorite scion or cultivar to. Vitis rupestris was also crossed with Vitis berlandieri. This is a synonym for the Texas species that T.V. Munson sent over to Europe. A rupestris by berlandieri cross yields a rootstock named 1103P. Similarly, Vitis riparia was also crossed with Vitis berlandieri, and that produced a rootstock that's named SO4. So the thing to keep in mind here is that these native North American grapevines that by themselves are not, or I would say are rarely grown for grapes used to make wine, have been involved in an international 150, almost 200-year effort to produce the rootstocks, the root systems to which the global grape industry is grafted. Okay, so this is just a picture of the native habitat of Vitis riparia. Another picture, Vitis riparia grows in the northeastern quarter, more or less, of the United States. It's a very widespread species. I took this picture in southern central Wisconsin a few years back. Many of you have probably seen Vitis riparia around the state of Missouri. It's another species that's been really important in the development of rootstocks. Now, what's cool is that these rootstock varieties, with these funny names that I introduced some of them in the last slide. There are others. These rootstock varieties that are derived from native North American grapevine species have specific properties that are of interest to grapevine breeders and grapevine growers. So I mentioned Vitis, the 3309C, that's a product of Vitis riparia crossed with rupestris. That's a very phylloxera-resistant rootstock. Same with 10114. I didn't mention that, but that's another clone derived from an F1 from the same cross. 1103P that has this Texas species berlandieri in its background. It offers phylloxera resistance, but it can also be used on soils that have a high pH. And there are many other categorizations and descriptions of the specific uses of different rootstocks within the viticulture industry. All right, so back to this complexity of the grapevine. This is just a picture of a grapevine I took in an experimental vineyard in southwestern Missouri. But you can see here, you have a scion that was grafted to a rootstock, and there's kind of this joint or this bulge where the two individuals have attempted to grow together. This is a very healthy grapevine. Kind of a grafting junction like this that's a little swollen is very common. But I just wanted to reiterate that the grapevines that we grow and that we harvest for grapes for eating and for wine, again, these are called the scion and the rootstock, are really complicated organisms. And usually, grapevines have this Vitis vinifera either wholly as the scion, or that vinifera is grafted, or I'm sorry, is hybridized with other grapevine species from North America to form these French American hybrids like Chambourcin that we talked about. So in this case, Vitis rupestris has been used to form Chambourcin that is serving as the scion. But at the same time, if we go into the rootstock, we have seen that rootstocks are commonly derived from crosses between two of three native North American species, this Cineraria variety, Helleri, Riparia, and rupestris. So in this case, we have the rock grape, Vitis rupestris, contributing both to the development of the scion and to the development of the rootstock. All right, so is it just phylloxera resistance that is desirable to grapevine breeders and growers for rootstocks? No, I mean, phylloxera resistance was why grafting got started in grapevines, and it's why we have to keep it going. Anywhere there's phylloxera present, grafting is required. But grafting is now being used, and these native North American rootstocks are now being used to improve viticulture in other ways besides phylloxera resistance. So this top figure just shows some of the things that matter for grafting. One of the most important things is graft compatibility. So you have to make sure that whatever it is you're using as a scion will graft well to whatever rootstock you're interested in. But people are using grafting. They're also focusing on the ease of vegetative propagation. People are now using grafting not only for root pest or pathogen resistance, as was the case for phylloxera, but they're using grafting to introduce abiotic stress tolerance to the grapevine. So to try to combat things like drought, flooding, salty soil conditions, other soil conditions. Grafting is used to force dwarfing in some crops, mostly apple. So when you go to Eckert's to collect apples in the fall, and you are collecting apples from these trees that are really low to the ground, and it's super easy for your kids to grab the apples, that is because those apple trees are grafted to a scion or a rootstock that imparts a dwarf stature to the plant. Folks graft for precocity, fruit development, for productivity, for fruit quality, for shoot pest and pathogen resistance. So we know from our work and others that the rootstock not only affects how the vine grows below ground, but it actually has a measurable effect on attributes of the grafted scion. Lastly, cold tolerance. So the message here really is that grafting, and particularly grafting in grapevines, is really just at the tip of the iceberg. And there's a lot of natural variation in the species used for grafting that we think we've only scratched the surface on in terms of what those native North American grapevines can do for the grape industry globally. So what we're doing in my lab based here at the Danforth Center and at SLU, one of the things we're doing is we've planted an experimental vineyard in the St. Louis area where we're trying to understand the genetic basis in the rootstock of the effects that we see on the scion. And we're doing this because we think this might be helpful in terms of selecting which rootstocks to use for specific effects on the scion. This is a grapevine, a vineyard where there are 145 different rootstocks to which a common cultivar is grafted. This is Marquette. It's a French American red grape variety. This is a picture I took, I think it was on Monday of this week. And then the other thing we're doing is exploring other native North American grapevine species that historically have not been used in grafting in grapevines, but might be of use. So one that really rises to the top of the pile here is Vitis arizonica. This is a species native to the Southwest that's of interest because it is very drought tolerant. And as the conditions in grape growing regions in California, but even in Arizona, this is a vineyard, believe it or not, planted in Arizona. The folks are looking at these species like Vitis arizonica as an additional potential rootstock for those climates. Okay, so we're going to leave grapevines in just a moment here, but I wanted to just kind of wrap this up by saying that native North American grapevines have really, I think, played an incredible role in shaping viticulture globally, both in terms of their contributions to the scions through the development of French American hybrids that are disease resistant above ground, and in terms of their contributions to the rootstocks, which have allowed viticulture globally to survive this, what is now essentially a global phylloxera spread, and to grow in regions that have phylloxera in them, but still folks can still grow their local varieties like that Verdejo that we saw in Spain. Okay, so I'm going to switch topics now because it's not just grapevines that are wild species that have potential for agriculture. And so in the remaining time, what I wanted to do was to talk about some other, what I'll call emerging botanical superstars that I think are particularly exciting in terms of their potential for agriculture. And in this section of the talk, I'm going to focus on that second term that I introduced, that relatively wild crops. So these are wild species that have really only recently entered the domestication pipeline. So it's not like grapes. Grapes were one of the oldest crops known. They've been grown for at least 8,000 years. What we're talking about now are species that really were not domesticated by early farmers, but are being explored for their potential role in this like current agricultural revolution, which is focused not only on feeding people, but also adapting agriculture so that it is offering important ecosystem services and not harming our environment. So I have a picture here of Silphium integrifolium. This is known commonly as rosinweed. It's a close relative of the compass plant, native here in the Midwest. This is one of the species that we are working with at the moment. All right, so just to give a little context for this, most of the agriculture that we see in our neck of the woods looks something like this, where we have annual plants, in this case, corn. It's grown in a monoculture, meaning it's the only thing in the field. And this is basically how agriculture happens. This is how we feed humanity, essentially, both in the US and everywhere. But this system has some downsides. And one of the downsides is that because it's an annual crop grown in a monoculture, the field lays bare, essentially. These are just like small little weeds, but it's pretty much bare half of the year. And the absence of continuous living cover, the absence of living root systems, is contributing to the loss of soil. And this is no joke. We know that roughly half of the world's topsoil has been lost in the last 150 years. And we know that this is due, at least in part, to the way we practice agriculture. And it has led to some pretty drastic consequences. Some of you may have seen pictures of the dust bowls that happened in the 1930s. This is a postcard from Rolla, Kansas, of a giant dust storm coming in. And these dust storms, of course, pick up in part because of the bare soil that exists in the area, of course, in combination with various climatic factors. But what's really striking is these dust bowls are not a thing of the past. It was just a couple of years ago, and I think again even last year, that there was a giant dust storm in Illinois, caused a huge pileup on 55. There was dust in the city of Chicago. I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of it in this presentation. But suffice to say, this is still an issue. And so when we think about adapting agriculture for the future, one of the things we're thinking about is how can we use agriculture to hold on to our soils and even more so help build them, help regenerate them. So one of the ways that folks are thinking about this is through looking at natural prairies. Grasslands, of course, a lot of the plants that we grow here in the Midwest are actually grasses like corn. And when we look at a natural prairie, one of the things that stands out, this is a beautiful picture, famous picture by Heidi Natura, is that there are first a diversity of species. Second, those species have a diversity of root systems that are persistent. They live for multiple years, and they're quite extensive and deep. And this is what's below the soil line here. These root systems are what hold soil in place, and they are what regenerate it. So this picture, and most prairie species are long-lived or perennial species. Most prairies consist of multiple species growing together. So that presents an interesting question. Can we reimagine our agricultural systems as something that looks more like a prairie? Okay, maybe this is crazy. How would it work? If we look at, again, back to our annual monoculture of corn, everything's growing nice and neat in rows. Everything matures at the same time. Harvest happens in the fall. If we look at a prairie, it's kind of the opposite. We've got lots of different species. They're growing in a bunch of wild mixtures. They're not harvested. They persist for however many years, decades, maybe even. I don't think, I'm not advocating here that we harvest a prairie or that we make an agricultural system that looks like a prairie, but the attributes of the prairie that we're focused on here are perenniality, species that live for multiple years, and diversity, plots that have more than one species in them. And so maybe we can get to some type of like very simple happy medium where we have in this case, just even two perennial species that are growing in a mixture-ish, alternating rows in the case of this experiment. So what we think, and the case for the botanical superstars I'm trying to make here is that these perennial herbaceous species may be like really important components of future agricultural systems. The challenge is that until recently, these guys were never domesticated. So we don't really have crops yet. But some of the stuff that we're working on and people are working on in various institutions around the country and the world are moving that forward, which I think is quite exciting. All right, so I wanted to tell one story of how this is happening, and there's lots of different stories out there. This is a story of a perennial rice, and in this case, this is kind of a mix-up, right, of our crop wild relative plus relatively wild crop story. So rice is, one of the most important crops globally in terms of the number of calories provided for people. Also ancient crop, also an annual species. A few years back, a group of scientists, many of which are listed here, based in China, made a cross between a perennial rice, Oryza longistaminata, which is a wild species, and an annual rice, Oryza sativa. And they grew that plant up for multiple generations. They selected on it for yield. This is the annual rice on the figure A. Figure B is the perennial rice, and this is what the hybrids look like. And then they compared the yield, and they compared how it grew to annual rice. So one of the questions has been, if if growing perennial grains was possible, why didn't somebody do it before? It must not be possible. Maybe you just can't get a perennial grain that makes lots of seeds. Okay, well, the long and the short of it here is you can. And in this particular example, shown in black is the annual rice, shown in red is the perennial rice. This shows grain yield, and this grain yield goes over 5 years. And in this case, they were harvesting 2 times per year, in the fall and in the spring. So that's why you get these kind of waves, because the fall harvest is higher in yield and from the spring harvest. Main point here is that the annual rice shown in black and the perennial rice shown in red basically produce equivalent yields over the course of 4 years. At the 5th year, we start to see the perennial rice falling off. Also relevant is when you look at the cost of growing this, annual rice requires basically replanting every year. And of course, that costs money. Perennial plants doesn't have to happen. So when you consider the labor input, and you consider that for annual rice, AR, and perennial rice, PR, the cost of actually planting is the same. But the cost of regrowth, replanting, is much, much higher for the annual rice relative to the perennial rice. So over this 4 or 5 year period, it's much less expensive to actually keep these plants in the ground. Okay, beyond that, we can quantify profit between annual rice shown in black and perennial rice shown in red. And because of these differences in labor, the profit is actually higher in this perennial system. And then lastly, the whole motivation for shifting or expanding the perennial herbaceous crops is to improve the soil. And here, this graph shows soil accumulation, soil organic carbon accumulation in an annual rice system compared to perennial rice in years 2, 3, and 4. And what you can see, not surprisingly, is that we see more soil organic carbon accumulation over time in this perennial system. So this is another example of how wild plants like this Oryza longistaminata can contribute in important ways to the development of, in this case, a new crop of perennial rice. So just as we kind of start to wrap up here, we've talked about basically developing crops using crop wild relatives with grapes and then with this rice. And then I wanted to just end with a little bit of a plug about some new wild species that are just starting to undergo selection to develop new crops. And the picture or the crop I'll highlight here is intermediate wheatgrass, or Thinopyrum intermedium. The trade name is Kernza. This is not a native species in North America, but we are growing it here. It's native to Asia, and it's a very close relative of wheat. It makes a seed and is harvested very similar to wheat. It's of interest because of its enormous root system. So here is this intermediate wheatgrass on the bottom, juxtaposed against an annual wheat on the top. And you can just see immediately why this species would be of interest for its below ground properties. Now, intermediate wheatgrass, trade name Kernza, this is a wild species that is, like I said, just under development now. There are multiple breeders working with it here in the US. It's been used to develop flour. So again, the trade name is Kernza. So you can order this flour from Perennial Pantry. You can order it from Sustainagrain. I use it in baking. This is a Dutch pancake I made. I usually just sub in half, whatever recipe I'm using, half of this Kernza flour and then half regular flour. It's also being used regularly in brewing. I mentioned at the beginning of this talk the beer that Blue Jay Brewery put together here in St. Louis with using Kernza. They're just releasing another one in the next couple of weeks. So it is moving into market. Aside from intermediate wheatgrass, there are other botanical superstars, or maybe emerging superstars that are under investigation. This is an experiment that we did a couple of years ago out at the Shaw Nature Reserve. This is mostly native species, Desmanthus illinoinensis, Glycyrrhiza lepidata, American licorice. Let's see what other, a couple of Elemis species, a native hordeum, a native sunflower. These are all perennial species that we are evaluating for potential development into perennial crops. So remember, there were no perennial herbaceous species domesticated by early farmers. Oh, and Silphium integrifolium. This is people are interested in developing this as an oilseed species, maybe an alternative to sunflower oil. All right, so the thing that is I'm thinking a lot about, and what I'd love for you guys to think about too, is which of our wild species are the progenitors of our future crops? We can use the relatives of our existing crops, like the rock grape, to improve our existing crops, like grapevine. And that's important and it's underway. But beyond that, I think there's a lot of space and a lot of need for agricultural innovation, and that is fundamentally dependent on wild plant species. So I'm not looking for hard answers. I'm personally inspired by the diversity of plants in our region and beyond. And I see really a key role for those species as we try to adapt to agriculture so that it not only provides people with what we need, but it provides the fundamental ecosystem services that I think are lacking in some of our current agricultural systems. Okay, so I'm going to just go ahead and stop there. Thank everybody for listening. This is a Helianthus maximilianus picture. And also thanks the funders of some of the work that I talked about today, the U.S. Botanic Garden, St. Louis University and the Danforth Plant Science Center, the National Science Foundation, the Land Institute, the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, and the Shaw Nature Reserve. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Allison. That was fantastic. I could have listened to you speak for, I don't know, 2 or 3 more hours. This is so fascinating and you presented it so well. We do have a couple of questions and we may have more coming in. This first question is about grapes, and we might, and if folks have other questions, we could maybe start with grapes first. So Brenda asks, many wine specialists agree that terroir affects the quality of the grape or the wine that results. That is the environment in which the grape is growing. But does the rootstock affect the wine or simply make the overall plant more resilient?
That is an awesome question. And we had the same question. And actually, for the past 10 years, we've been trying to figure that out. And so the first question, let me start with the question on how the rootstock affects the wine. Yes, rootstocks affect berry chemistry and wine volatiles. And we work with an enologist. An enologist is a it's a berry and wine chemist essentially, who analyzes not only the berry chemistry, but also the volatiles that come off of the wine. And we know that there are specific rootstocks that have particular effects on particular wine volatiles that breeders care about and winemakers care about. As far as the terroir goes, this is also a question that's been on our mind a lot. And we just last month planted an experimental vineyard here in St. Louis to try to understand the molecular basis of terroir. So terroir, again, is the influence of the land on the berry and on the wine. And it matters, what the soil is, what the slope is, what the humidity is, what the temperature is, like growing days, all of it. This is why grapes are so cool. They like bear this signature of the land. But what we're interested in is how does that happen and what even is it? What is that signature? So one of the hypotheses that we have is that there are epigenetic changes that happen. These are non-genetic changes to the DNA. It's often a molecule that attaches to the DNA. It doesn't change the A, G, C's, and T's, but it attaches to the DNA and it changes how that DNA is transcribed, how the genes in the DNA are expressed. And we think that there may be epigenetic modifications happening both in the scion and in the rootstock in response to the local environment that are changing attributes of the vine itself. So to test this hypothesis, we planted a vineyard of a particular combination of rootstocks and scions in St. Louis. We planted it in New York. We planted it in South Dakota, and we're putting it in Pennsylvania. And we are taking a baseline estimate of epigenetic modifications, epigenetic marks. We haven't done the work yet, but we did just sample the tissues. And then the plan is over the next 3 years, we'll continue to sample both the scion and the rootstock tissues, as well as other attributes of the vine, to be able to see if there is an accumulation of epigenetic marks that are unique to a particular location. And people have started looking at this, and I'm pretty sure we're going to find something. But again, we're like 6 weeks into that vineyard.
Wow, that is amazing to think of that at that level, that level of investigation. I had a question about grafting, and then there's another question here about grafting. Um, how do the the phloem and the xylem find each other? You know, the vascular tissue that are bringing nutrients and water up the stem or the trunk, and the nutrients from or the sugars from photosynthesis down. How do they? And I guess that might be why there's a wound there as they. Could you explain that a bit?
Yeah, well, I wish I knew all the details of it. Grafting, I talked about it like it's kind of easy, but it's not. And we know from firsthand experience, not all grafts take. They don't all fuse. And so how the xylem and phloem find each other, I think it's really, my opinion is that there are genetic attributes of different vines that make them more or less good, for lack of a better word, at being grafted. And I think part of that is how, just what you're talking about, Carol, is like how those tissues realign and connect. There is also a wound response involved in grafting because it is, you make a cut and then for both partners, I guess, before you have to cut them so that you can join them. And the way those wounds get responded to, I think, also plays a role in how well the tissues come together. There's different kinds of grafting, ways to make the fusion happen. I think that plays a role as well. But it's a finicky process, and we've failed many, many, many times. We've looked at hundreds, thousands of graft failures that tell us this. The last thing I'll add is people have started using X-ray CT scanning to actually see how those graft partners connect and where the connections happen and where they fail. That's not something that I'm looking at right now, but there's a really excellent scientist at Cornell who was formerly at the Danforth Center who's done some of this work. And it is fascinating to see how that, like, really how it happens on the inside.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. It looks like Carol has gotten a little disconnected, but I'd be happy to pick up where she left off. So I have a question in the Q&A that is, and it's related to what I also heard in your presentation about trials of growing multiple perennial crops in the same field. Do you have any examples of that with the work that you guys are doing at your trial gardens?
Sure. In terms of what we call it is a polyculture. instead of a monoculture with only one species, polycultures have multiple species. We have a couple experiments of polycultures here in St. Louis in the field. And our polyculture is pretty simple. It's actually a biculture.
Mm,
Well, we do have some tricultures, so 2 species versus 3 species. But we have rows of, a row of intermediate wheatgrass, and then a row of alfalfa, a row of intermediate wheatgrass, a row of alfalfa. And in our experiment, we've got those bicultures growing right next to monocultures because we're comparing the yield. Of course, the hypothesis is that the alfalfa, which is a legume which fixes nitrogen, is providing additional nitrogen to the intermediate wheatgrass, and that it will grow better without having to add any nitrogen to the experiment, which it is actually, but it hasn't been a problem. Like, we've been able to
mhm.
plant these seeds using a planter mechanically, and it's been fine. I guess the challenge we have had is there's some weed pressure in the early days of establishment, and it's just a lot of work to keep it cleaned up. Once the plants are big enough that the weeds can't find their way in, it's kind of smooth sailing.
Yeah, thank you for answering that. And we actually had another question that we received through the chat. Did you have any guidance at all on sourcing perennial vegetable seeds that are taken from these kinds of projects where people, even though things are still in kind of trial stages, could be able to start to do those at their homes?
Um, there is a wonderful citizen science project that our friends and colleagues at the Land Institute are running with Silphium. And the project is, and actually we're looking at Silphium right here. I think I mistakenly said it was Helianthus, but it's not, it's Silphium. That project is aimed at trying to bulk seeds. So one of the challenges of like developing a new crop is we just don't have like corn level seeds available to us. So I would check the Land Institute's Silphium Citizen Science program. And what that program does is it sends seeds to folks who want to help the effort and who want to try growing Silphium in their region. I mean, one of the questions is where does this plant grow and where does it grow well? That's a difficult thing to answer if you're a scientist because you just can't be in like 200 different places at one time. But if you have a group of people who are willing, who are distributed across the landscape, who are willing to give it a shot and willing to report back, that really helps. And that's what that project is all about. So again, it's the Silphium Citizen Science Project at the Land Institute. And there may be one with other crops as well. I just haven't looked at the website lately.
That is so helpful. I'll make sure to note that in our follow-up email. And then Carol's back.
So sorry about that. One thing I wanted to add is how important it is that groups like the Missouri Prairie Foundation, other conservation groups, other land trusts do to protect land, which provides habitat for native plants, for all of the reasons that Dr. Miller shared with us today. Because if we don't protect these original remnants and places, for example, where the Vitis rupestris grows or where Silphium species grow on prairies, we have less genetic material that could be used in the future for our own food crops. I don't think there are any other questions, but I'm going to turn it over now to Amanda to share some closing words and some things to look forward to. Different programming that we have for you. And thank you so very much, Dr. Miller, for your fantastic presentation. And I will let Amanda close you out.
Thank you so much. Access to this recording and other related information will be sent to all who registered in that follow-up email tomorrow afternoon. Before we conclude the webinar, I'm just going to give a couple of announcements about upcoming in-person and online events.
I don't know if it's just my computer, but I think maybe Amanda froze. So I'm sorry about these technical issues we've had today, but I believe that Amanda was telling you that she will be sending out a recording and other related information from today. And she also has some other announcements. On July 30th at 4 p.m. we have a free Grow Native webinar, Lessons Learned at Primrose Prairie with Sydney Ross. And on August 13th, we will have a webinar on dispelling myths of native gardening featuring Scott Woodbury, Aaron Holmes, Eric Eaton, and Nina Fogel. We have a walking tour of some native gardens in Alton, Illinois coming up. A free native pasture tour on August 1st, the MPF annual dinner on August 16th, and an introduction to Missouri fern identification and ecology workshop in Jefferson City on August 22nd. So you can sign up for our biweekly newsletter and get these events and more directly in your inbox, and follow us on our social media channels. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Dr. Miller. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.